The day Ethan Carter walked into that boardroom. Worn, out shoes, same cheap suit, hands on the table. He had spent 3 weeks building that presentation, 3 weeks of early mornings and late nights and skipped meals. And the CEO looked at it for 40 seconds, then looked at Ethan, then looked back at the room full of expensive suits and laughing faces and said, "Maybe stick to making coffee. Business strategy isn't for people like you." They all laughed, every single one of them. Nobody stopped it. Nobody said his name. Nobody said his name. Nobody said, "Wait." He just stood there holding the clicker, face burning, alone in a room full of people. My name is Marcus. And I've known Ethan Carter since we were broke kids sharing a 2-bedroom apartment in Queens. I watched this man eat instant ramen for dinner 3 nights a week. I watched him work doubles on the weekend just to keep the lights on. And I watched him take every single insult, every door slammed in his face, and disappear with it. Quiet. No threats, no anger, no public breakdown, just silence. The kind of silence that builds things. By the time those executives figured out what Ethan had become, it was already too late. This is his story. Ethan landed the internship through sheer persistence. No connections, no referrals, no alumni network reaching out on his behalf. He applied 14 times to the same firm before they finally let him through the door. The firm was mid-sized by Wall Street standards, but to a kid from Queens with worn out shoes and a car that barely started, it felt like stepping into another universe. He worked hard, came in early, stayed late, studied every deal, read every filing, but none of that mattered to the men at the top. What they saw was the suit, the shoes, the lunch he ate at his desk because he couldn't afford to go out. And one afternoon, during an actual board presentation, Ethan stood up to walk the executives through a market strategy he'd spent 3 weeks building. The CEO, a man named Victor, looked at the slides for about 40 seconds. Then he leaned back in his chair, turned to the room, and said, "Maybe stick to making coffee. Business strategy isn't for people like you." The room laughed. Not a polite chuckle, not an awkward silence. They actually laughed. Ethan stood there, face burning, hands still holding the clicker. Nobody said a word in his defense, not one person. He sat back down, finished the meeting, packed up his laptop, and never showed emotion again. Not once. The internship ended with nothing. No offer, no letter, no handshake. Victor didn't even remember his name by the time Ethan cleaned out his desk. So Ethan went home to Queens. Back to the ramen, back to the doubles, back to the tiny apartment. But something had shifted. He started spending every free hour reading, not novels, not Reddit, business acquisition law, distressed asset valuation, debt restructuring, the mechanics of how companies collapse and who picks up the pieces. The learning curve was brutal. He made bad investments, lost money he didn't have, sat across from investors who spoke over him, dismissed him, and walked out mid-pitch. There were months, real months, where every door closed. I remember calling him one winter and asking if he was okay. He said, "I'm exactly where I need to be." I didn't understand that then. I do now, because while Ethan was quietly failing forward in the background, the men who laughed at him were flying private, collecting bonuses, and assuming the world would always work exactly the way it had always worked for them. They weren't watching Ethan. Nobody was watching Ethan. That was the point. If you know someone who's been written off by people who should have known better, share this story with them right now. They need to hear it. And if you haven't subscribed yet, stay with me, because this next part is the reason this story exists. 1 company became 5, 5 became 12, 12 became a web of holding companies and private equity vehicles that nobody on the outside could fully map. Ethan wasn't buying flashy businesses. He wasn't chasing headlines. He was buying leverage, supply chain companies, logistics firms, niche financial service providers that plugged into larger corporations like silent infrastructure. Nothing visible, everything strategic. By the time he was 31, Ethan Carter controlled more of the financial ecosystem in his sector than most people inside it realized. Not because he was lucky, because for 10 years he had been completely invisible, and had used that invisibility like a weapon. He once told me, The loudest people in any room always underestimate the quiet ones, every single time. Then came the recession. Not a slow burn, a hard stop. Markets tightened, credit dried up. Several mid-sized firms found themselves over-leveraged with nowhere to turn. Victor's firm was one of them. The board was desperate. They needed a financial group, a serious buyer, willing to step in, restructure the debt, and stabilize the business before everything unraveled. A meeting was arranged. Same city, different building. But that long, polished conference table, same energy. The executives sat down in expensive suits with forced smiles, and the particular kind of nervous energy that comes from knowing you need someone else to save you. The door opened. Ethan walked in. Nobody spoke. One executive actually put his pen down slowly, like he needed a moment to process what he was seeing. Victor stared. Ethan took the head of the table, the seat where the power sits. His lawyer slid a document package across to each of them, and as they really read, the details of who exactly was making this offer, who controlled the debt instruments they'd been leveraging, who held significant stakes in 3 of their largest counterparties. It became very clear every thread led back to one name: Ethan Carter, the intern, the kid in the worn-out shoes, the one Victor had publicly humiliated in front of a roomful of people who laughed. One executive tried an apology, stumbling, vague. Another blamed market conditions, as if that explained anything. Victor said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, he said he'd always thought Ethan had potential. Ethan let him finish. Then he looked around the table, slowly, calmly, no performance in it, and said, "Interesting. I remember you telling me that business strategy wasn't for people like me." Silence. Real silence. Then, almost to himself, with a soft half-smile, "Looks like I've been making coffee for a very long time. The difference is now I own the building." Nobody laughed this time. Nobody had anything to say. They picked up their pens, and they signed. Ethan didn't celebrate after that meeting. He didn't post about it, didn't call anyone. He texted me one line. "It's done." That was it, because that's who he is. The revenge was never about the moment. It was about the decade, the invisible work, the cold patience, the refusal to let humiliation define the ceiling. Victor and those executives thought they were dealing with a kid who didn't belong in the room. They were right. He didn't belong in their room. He was building his own. If this story hit different for you, share it with one person who's in the middle of their grind right now. The quiet ones, the ones nobody's watching. They need to know the silence is the strategy. Subscribe to the channel. We tell the stories the world forgets to notice. And if you want to see what Marcus's own story looks like, it's next.